Hello, and welcome to today's webinar, Security in OpenEdge, an Introductory Primer. My name is Barbara Ware, and I'll be your host for today. I'd like to take care of a couple of housekeeping slides to give you a closer look at the control panel and how you can participate. First, to open and hide your control panel, just click on the orange highlighted arrow at the top shown here. Secondly, there are two options for joining audio. To use VoIP, simply select mic and speakers under audio, and to dial in using your phone, select telephone and dial in using the information that is provided. And lastly, all lines will be muted for today, but we have a live Q&A session at the end of the presentation. If you have a question at any time during the webinar, simply submit your question via the question section of the webinar control panel located at the top right of your screen. We will be collecting all questions via this control panel, and we'll address them at the end of the presentation. One final note, today's webinar and questions will be recorded, and we will be posting the webinar to our website shortly. Our guest speaker today is Chad Thompson, Senior Principal Solutions Consultant at Progress, who has been consulting on OpenEdge for the last 17 years. He got his first introduction to Progress as a developer with a partner in 1997 and has been evangelizing our technology ever since. Additionally, today we are joined by Chris Longo and Tanya O'Connor, who will be participating in the Q&A at the end of the presentation. So at this time, I'd like to turn it over to Chad. Welcome, Chad.
Thanks for that introduction, Barbara, and thanks for all of you for attending today's webinar. We have a great deal of information to cover, and this is a pretty short webinar, so let's just get right into it. The topic of today's webinar, or the ultimate goal to this session, is information assurance. Information assurance is the practice of managing risks related to the use, processing, storage, and transmission of information or data, and the systems and processes used for those purposes. It includes protection of the integrity, availability, authenticity, non-repudiation, and confidentiality of user data. The ultimate goal and the central asset that we're going to be looking at here is protection of your OpenEdge data. We're going to be addressing information assurance from an OpenEdge application point of view. It's virtually impossible to cover security topics from an enterprise level in a short webinar such as this, so that's why we're going to be addressing them from an OpenEdge point of view only. It is, after all, just a primer. But it's also the first in a series of security-focused webinars. This diagram depicts a typical OpenEdge environment topology, represented at a fairly high level. While security encompasses the entire enterprise landscape, our presentation focusing on OpenEdge-specific security concerns includes things like your local and network OpenEdge clients, GUI, CHUI, as well as SQL, JDBC, and ODBC clients. Not to mention web clients connected to web servers and app servers, all of which ultimately accessing your OpenEdge database. The modern OpenEdge toolset makes it easier to apply security best practices to your application environment. Back in the good old days, it used to be that few in an organization took direct interest in enterprise security or information assurance. Typically, IT administrators were the only ones thinking in that way. As long as things worked, nobody else really took an active interest. However, interest soon expanded. The interest of executives, management, and auditors in our security grew, not to mention the requirements of customers or clients have increased. Maybe you've heard, does your system do this from a security perspective? Or in order for us to do business, your system must do this. Add to that, industry standards have changed, grown, or are now being enforced. For example, HIPAA compliance. And lastly, if you're part of a public organization, you also have all of those shareholder interests to protect. There is a new level of visibility in the game and a whole new breed of stakeholder. New levels of concerns means new levels of responsibility. That responsibility and concern for information assurance starts at the executive level, and this is paramount. If what we're talking about here is protecting your future legacy of the company, the brand, the image. It's beyond simply money. Properly addressing information assurance is not just a bottom line monetary effort. everybody should be concerned when it comes to information assurance, and they should have a vested interest in saying, we need to address this. This graphic represents statistical data of recently reported security compromises. The first area highlights the average time from initial intrusion to compromise. In other words, the time it took to bypass security and access the primary asset. The vast majority, 54%, took only hours to access the asset, while 25% took minutes or less. The second area describes the time from compromise to detection. Again, in other words, when the victim noticed there was a compromise. The majority, 31%, took years to notice the compromise. 17% took months. These two segments suggest 48% of victims took months to years just to notice the fact that there was indeed a compromise in their security. The last area depicts the time from detection to containment. This means once they knew there was a compromise, short of just pulling the plug, how long did it take to fix the gap? 61% of respondents took months to years to correct or contain the compromise. Consider the recent news stories of public corporations responsible for managing the credit data of millions of people. A vulnerability in a third-party vendor application they used was identified and patched by their vendor March of 2017. The intrusions took place someplace between that point and May, when those breaches were discovered by the corporation. The compromised data was personally identifiable data and records of 141 million people. Now, the event was only publicized months later, hopefully in an effort to not draw more attention to themselves so they could patch and revise their security plan. Now ask yourself, what if it was your company or your customer's data that was exposed? How would your company have fared if it was subject to a similar situation? Up until now, some terms have been thrown around, such as compromise and intrusion. There'll be more terms to come, but here are some commonly used ones when discussing information security. First is threat. A threat is any activity that affects the health, performance, and/or well-being of an application, enterprise, or primary audience. Threat agent is a person, application, script, or service which performs to gain access to protected areas of networks and applications by bypassing or exploiting various vulnerabilities within the target ecosystem. The reason why this term is used is there isn't always a person at a terminal or somebody out there clicking your website. There are bots and scripts that do not sleep, and your defenses are under constant barrage. The next terms are attack vector and attack surface. Each individual point of a vulnerability is considered an attack vector. For example, buffer overflow attack, cross-site scripting attacks. An example of a more publicized one you may have heard of, protocol flaws. Consider the OpenSSL Heartbleed issue. The sum of the different points where malicious activity first interacts with your environment or application is an attack surface. Today, with the introduction of service-based applications, more potential attack vectors are presented. This means the attack surface will expand as your environment or application does. To begin addressing attack surfaces or the attack surface of your environment, follow these 3 steps. Step number 1 is to visualize. Draw diagrams depicting all the systems of an enterprise, of your enterprise, and map out all devices, paths, and networks, including your data assets. Step 2 is to find indicators of exposure, examining all the touch points between those applications and systems and the movement of data between those systems. Then highlight potential areas of concern. Step 3 is beginning the actual detection of that compromise. The term legacy here doesn't necessarily relate to your application, as in legacy ABL application. It means potential vulnerabilities once ignored or thought benign that may still exist. They've existed for a long time. Some examples of this are applications that aren't designed with security in mind. Since there's a new breed of attacks and a new breed of attacker finding new ways to exploit your application, you may need to revisit your application's design. Consider if you wrote an OpenEdge web speed application 5 or 6 years ago, runs just fine, seeing lots of traffic, no overt problems. How will it hold up to attacks like cross-site scripting or cross-site request forgery? Other examples can be as simple as your operating system and software packages haven't been updated. Maybe you're transferring sensitive data between systems on your network, thought it to be safe, but you are doing file drops between a system that has an encrypted data source, and when the file is dropped on the other server, the file is left unencrypted on disk. Of course, lack or weak identity management within the application or OpenEdge database allowing the blank user ID are also potential examples of legacy vulnerabilities. When mitigating these legacy vulnerabilities, some options could be doing almost nothing. If you believe your data or environment is at low risk, then maybe you should relax, sit back, go to the beach. Or, at bare minimum, patch and update your OpenEdge products, staying at the latest releases. Also, you may wish to keep your logs on hand from certain periods for review, should there be any compromises. Also, considering the surrounding environment, you might want to upgrade your operating system as well as firewall appliances. Applying existing security options to existing applications. For example, the Web Speed Workshop in OpenEdge. How many sites out there running in production with the Web Speed Workshop open? Well, that's not very secure. Do I need to apply any software to turn that off? No, just flip the switch. So how many other places in your applications have you not enabled already existing security features? Within the production environment, it's also important that you might want to only install required OpenEdge products, as well as produce a secure configuration, lock down any configuration folders, as well as run RCode only. Don't include the working folder inside your production runtime ProPath. Implementing identity management is also vital. Using client principal object within the ABL that asserts your identity is useful. Introducing modern versions of OpenEdge security products is also handy. Consider the OpenEdge Authentication Gateway. The first step to implementing an information security plan begins with assessment. Produce a diagram of your application servers, databases, and network touchpoints. Identify any third-party software for possible vulnerabilities, as well perform audits on your OpenEdge application platform, not just the code base. How you set up your products like PASOE or WebSpeed can make a lot of difference to the application security as a whole. The next step, perform a risk assessment. The risk assessment allows the enterprise to identify valuable assets and plan for the continued protection of those assets. It's generally more productive to focus on finding high likelihood and high impact threats as opposed to evaluating all possible combinations of threat agent attack and vulnerability. Focus on the threats that center around your most prized asset. In my estimation, that should be the database. And remember, threats can originate from internal resources. Consider that person who goes to the cafe at lunch and hops on the cafe's public Wi-Fi. They pick up some flavor of malware or virus. That could produce a threat internal to your network. How about that nosy employee who's just sifting through data or just sifting through the database or looking at folders on the server? Is that a threat? Is that a risk? How about the accomplice model? Maybe you have the begrudged, disgruntled employee who's helping out somebody on the outside or on his own. Those types of threats originate from inside your network, not just outside. And lastly, of course, during your assessment, remember that your job is to mitigate the possible attack vectors. You may never be able to eliminate all the risk points. During your risk assessment, assign a rank to each risk and list them accordingly from greater to lesser risks. Address the high value ones first and high risk areas first. Build a plan to address those areas and then potentially revisit the other ones at a later date. It may not be reasonable or cost-effective to address all risks at one time. When determining your risks, examine how accessible your data is. Look at how the data is accessed from inside your network as well as out. Consider how the data is being transmitted to and from each system or service. Once you have your risk assessment report established, describe and apply appropriate countermeasures. Patching the OS, for example. Ask yourself at each step, though, is this an active or a passive countermeasure? Your plan should detect potential threats early and often. Early detection of threats is critical. Otherwise, threat agents can perfect their attack by trying over and over again, going undetected until they reach their goal. Compromise detection requires 3 elements. 1, security-relevant events at a bare minimum. While other logging settings can be adjusted inside an application or other software, security-related events, even positives, should always be logged. Step 2, plan to ensure those logs are monitored regularly. And 3, establish a plan to respond, not react, when an intrusion is detected. Now, to put your plan into place, focus on the key point here is protecting your most valuable assets as a result of your risk assessment. In this case, I'll focus on the data. If a third party requires it, or maybe even if it doesn't, you might want to consider encrypting the data at rest when the DB, your database, is on disk or when there's files on disk. From an application point of view, you could potentially shell out to a third-party application like PGP or GPG, etc., and you can encrypt those files for transfer, as well as you could potentially use that same method for encrypting values before storing them into your database. However, key management can become an issue, as well as seed and unlocking those values. What would happen if you lost the key to those values? What would be the cost of that? How could you recover them? So there's a lot of thinking that goes into designing that style of solution. Another step could be use OpenEdge programmatic encryption. So at runtime, your ABL code encrypts only the fields or records or whatever it is that you want before they're stored either on disk or in the database. If database level encryption is a consideration or potentially requirement, you could introduce the OpenEdge Transparent Data Encryption product. The TDE product allows you to pick and choose which tables to encrypt, and you don't have to encrypt the database as a whole. It's also easily maintained with provided policy tooling, and it's also a seamless integration into your OpenEdge environment where your clients don't necessarily need to know, as the data is encrypted and decrypted as data is accessed or stored from the database server. One vital aspect in protecting your data is its state while it is transferred through your environment or across the wire. With the OpenEdge platform, it's possible to perform entire end-to-end encryption of in-flight data and, as you saw with TDE, the data at rest as well. So a request from a web client in this example may access our data using an HTTPS or SSL certificate, accessed through the firewall, through our web server. That HTTPS or encryption or encrypted channel can continue inbound through that inbound side firewall through the application server directly down to the database. The entire channel can be encrypted. Another point of protection is to restrict access to your data, allowing only authenticated users or credentials to access the database. The foremost step in this process is disallowing access to the database from any blank user ID credential. Introduction of the OpenEdge Authentication Gateway is also possible. The OpenEdge Authentication Gateway acts as a third-party authentication token service. Once enabled, no connections to the database will be permitted without first obtaining credential validation from the OpenEdge Gateway. As well, it's possible to configure the gateway to validate the user credentials against a third-party source, for example, LDAP sources. The OAG can be configured to expect a valid TLS certificate from each client system prior to allowing access to the database. This applies to all clients attempting to connect to the OAG-enabled database, including SQL clients. So what would happen in this instance, you would enable the OAG on the database, generate this client certificate, and distribute it to each client system that you want to allow access to your database. If the OpenEdge application gateway enabled database expects that certificate to be present, no connections will be allowed if that client does not have that certificate installed on that system. So ask yourself at this point, is just because there is a valid authenticated credential presented, does that mean the access should be authorized or allowed to access the data? Moving on to the next step, monitoring within your environment. Monitoring is the primary means to detect intrusions or potential compromise. At bare minimum, as cited before, regardless of all other logging settings, any security-related actions should be logged. This acts as the primary location for detection of intrusion and compromise. How should you begin monitoring within your network? Consider creating operating system scripts or scheduled jobs. Additionally, OpenEdge management has log monitoring jobs. These are a possibility. You might also want to consider using a third-party log monitoring, shipping, or parsing product like the popular Elk stack. In any case, moving the logs to a remote storage area where they can be indexed and parsed. Aside from your application logs, which should be your primary area, your primary event data sources are OpenEdge database logs, the OpenEdge auditing data. How about the OpenEdge change data capture data sets? Web server and firewall logs can also be included as your data sources, but be careful about operating system level logs, as well as web server or firewall logs, as they're subject to compromise. Now ask yourself this at this point. Is OpenEdge auditing a security feature? Would you consider it passive or active? The next step in intrusion detection is notification. Your monitoring mechanism should notify you of a suspected intrusion. It should be able to send email, perhaps instant message, or maybe a multimedia system message over an API. When sending out notification messages, send it to trusted recipients. Don't send it to the global email group. Don't light a red light on top of the building, as you might tip off would-be insiders to the attack. When you are notified, analyze the data that triggered the alert, trace and triage the incident, and try to depict who, what, where, when, how this alert was triggered in an attempt to identify any false positives. Then consider tweaking the detection plan. Now, should you actually decide that this notification is a result of a potential intrusion, the very, very first step is take a breath. Don't panic. This is why you have a plan in place. Now, how you respond to a potential intrusion is also very, very key. Now, the key word here is respond, not react. A response is a planned action to input. A reaction is an unplanned movement, more like a knee-jerk behavior. We want to respond to potential intrusion. Store off as much information as you can. Take a snapshot of application statistics or session tables. Log also who was logged into that app at the time of the intrusion. Include also in your report operating system stats. Who was logged in? What were they doing? What were they running? What application? How long were they logged in? Were they potentially idle? Should they have been on that system? Store this information in a secure, remote location. If you store this auditing information on a server or system that's already been compromised or potentially already been compromised, that leaves that data open to compromise. So store that data away for parsing and inspection later on. Now, when or if you make the decision to cut the wire and disconnect this potential intruder or this threat agent, do it from the perimeter of the attack or as far away from the database as possible. If they're already getting your data, they're already into your database, just disconnecting them from the database isn't going to stop them from getting that data that they've already taken. So disconnect them from the database isn't necessarily the first step. Plus, if you did disconnect the threat agent from the database, they may suspect that, and they will most likely just disconnect and cover their tracks as they reel their connections back out. So cutting from the perimeter is a better solution when any information is compromised. There's potentially more information for you to collect following that disconnection. Now, it's important to periodically review your information assurance plans and processes. If you've updated systems, have they patched other potential gaps or risks? Have they created new ones is also a consideration. It's also wise to have a reputable third party perform penetration testing and security audits. You might also consider building a trend or analytic report from the collected data. This should include positives, false positives, as well as any potential stop threats. Provide these analytics and reports as feedback to the stakeholders to demonstrate that your plan is working or maybe places where it needs potential revision. Also, archive or purge the logged information periodically. Too much information just makes it difficult to find what you're looking for. It's like searching for that proverbial needle in a needle stack. Lastly, following any event, collect the facts and review the details with your core team. How accurate was your risk assessment? How did your response plan work? Are there any revisions necessary to the risk assessment or any other part of the plan? These are all considerations. If you're not paranoid, you haven't been paying attention. Here are some assets you can find on Progress.com to learn more. Additionally, you can download a trial version of OpenEdge 11.7 from Progress.com. While this was just a primer session, I hope you found it informative. Thank you for attending. We have a panel standing by, and I guess now is a good time to take questions.
Hello, everyone. This is Tanya O'Connor. I want to thank you for joining us today. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to anyone in APJ. I hope that you found the webinar to be extremely informative. I know that security is a hot topic today, and I had expected a number of questions, and we have just a few. So if you do have questions, please feel free to enter them via the questions panel, and we'll make sure that they get addressed today. So let's see. I'm joined here with my two subject matter experts, Chad Thompson, who delivered the presentation. Hi, Chad. Thank you.
Hey there.
And Chad. And also Christopher Longo. Hi, Christopher. Or Chris, probably, right?
I can, yeah.
All right, so we have a few questions. Let's get started. The first one is, does Progress offer any help in helping to assess what my current security setup is and whether or not it's sufficient? Chris, do you have an answer for that?
Sure, Tanya. Progress Services offers an assessment in the form of a security health check, and during that health check, what we do is we help our customers identify or articulate their attack surface, and once that's done, once we understand the attack surface and the potential threats, then we're able to come in and make suggestions for detecting and mitigating those potential risks that are out there. And I would also offer that we do that across a variety of different versions, so you don't have to be on the latest, greatest version to engage us for a security health check.
All right, great, Chris. Thank you. This question is for you, Chad. You mentioned that OpenEdge auditing, it can be active or passive. What exactly do you mean by this?
All right. With regards to OpenEdge auditing, merely by enabling it on your database or within your application, that starts the process of collecting data and storing it away. So you could argue that, well, that's an active process because it is actively collecting data. However, if you're trying to detect when things happen, when an intrusion or a suspicious activity is occurring, auditing doesn't tell you that. Auditing merely just stores away what it's seeing in the events that you stored. So in order for you to tell that an audited event is potentially malicious, you actually have to take the reins and actually scan that audited data. So OpenEdge auditing can be considered both a passive and an active from the collection point of view process. But in this session, I think we've demonstrated that it's more considered a passive strategy where it's merely collecting data. It's up to you to actually parse and discern that data is indeed, or the data that you're receiving represents potential malicious activity.
All right, great. Here's a question, Chris, that actually we did not address during the webinar. The question is, how would encryption of the database work with replication like Pro 2? I'm sorry, Chris, Chad, let me pass it to you, Chad.
Sure. So the question was, how does encrypting the database work with replication, for example, like Pro 2? For example, if we deal with the Pro 2 example, Pro 2 is shipping transactions to a remote data source or a remote target. So it actually executes in its own ABL space. When a transaction happens on the source database, that record is in OpenText. It is in source. Pro 2 does receive that as just a normal replication trigger, so it'll actually have the source of that record, assuming it hasn't been encrypted by runtime ABL, and that record will be shipped across to whatever target the Pro 2 has set up on it. From an encryption point of view, what Pro 2 collects and ships will be the source of the record.
All right, great. Here's a question about client principal, Chad. We're not using the client principal. How intensive would a basic implementation be by approximation? And I'm getting the signal that this is actually Chris's expertise, client principal.
So the client principal is a mechanism used to assert an identity. It can be completely maintained via the ABL, but you have some alternatives, choices as you move into the Progress App Server or PaaS. The client principal can originate from Spring Security and then be used to assert an identity on an ABL client. And beyond that, if you implement the OpenEdge Authentication Gateway, it's specifically designed for maintaining client principal. So, the answer really kind of depends on your own architecture and situation. In its simplest form, though, it can be created and maintained completely within an ABL client using ABL.
Okay, great. Here's Chad. Is there any way to identify if there are any security glitches, lapses, either in the database or in the programming logics corresponding to an application?
I think the way to answer that one is it depends on your application. There's very little way to tell from just merely watching or saying this is the application I have. There's two ways to look at it. You could look at it just from watching the behavior and input of an application. For example, one would think of a website where you could do SQL injections, or in this case, you could potentially do ABL injection. Looking at it from the UI perspective, one should also consider that type of attack, or if you will, intrusion, can also be active on a TTY client also. If any data that gets fed into, or for that matter, even a GUI client, data that gets fed into your screen should be scrubbed and should be validated in some fashion. So by looking at a screen or testing a screen, you can tell from the results, is this screen secure? And what that kind of feeds back to you is, what is my logic doing? If my logic at this UI level isn't necessarily handling the encoding or scrubbing of input data, maybe it's time for me to actually look at the underpinnings of this application too. From a high level, it's fairly difficult to tell if an application is quote unquote secure. Of course, a quick security scan of the login logic or crucial transaction areas or calculation areas for that matter. Is there any authorization logic in there? Or as Chris pointed out, use of the CPO object on the session.
Okay, so we're getting a number of questions about when can we get more information. So this was a primer, and obviously security is a huge topic. We have plans to deliver a series of webinars on security. The next one is planned for the early December timeframe, potentially also one in November. But the question here is, because this was just a primer, are you planning any free of charge webinars to go further on these security issues, for example, transparent data encryption? So all of our webinars are absolutely free of charge, and the answer is yes to that. But if you have specific questions about products such as TDE, we encourage you to reach out to your account managers because they have all the information that you would need, and they can talk about your very specific situation. You can also reach out to Progress Services. As Chris mentioned, we do an assessment or a health check, and so we can take a look at your full environment and provide recommendations. Let's see, what else do we have here? The other question that we have is about Authentication Gateway in terms of versioning. What version of OpenEdge is Authentication Gateway available? And OpenEdge Authentication Gateway is available with OpenEdge 11.7. So you do need to upgrade to 11.7 to be able to be able to use that technology. Let's see what else we have here. I'm going to pass this one to you, Chad. Is there ever an instance where you would want to enable both OpenEdge auditing and CDC? So this is not necessarily security. Yeah, it is. Or do these not collect the same kind of data?
Yeah, if there's ever a point where you'd want to enable both CDC and Pro2. Yeah, I could see that. There are some instances where you'd want that. CDC gives you the ability to scope down your kept data, right? Your captured data at a field or column level. This is the data that I want kept. So you can actually scope it right down to a very specific field. While Pro2 is meant more for the user that wants to basically just ship the entire record from a transactional point of view to an external source. So would there ever be an instance where you have, say, an enterprise database with both Pro2 and CDC enabled? Yes, I can see a lot of instances where you would have that set up.
Okay, great. You talked about keeping current with OpenEdge. How important is it to upgrade from OE 10X to OE 11X? Are there major security upgrades in OE 11X? I actually know the answer to this question, Chad, but I'm going to pass it to you because I want you to be a little bit more specific about the technologies.
Well, I'd be curious to hear your answer. But no, absolutely. Progress's focus is of course making the most professional application platform possible, and with that comes the necessity to make sure that our assets as well as our customer assets, specifically again related to the database and the language itself, are protected in the means that our customers require. And in the 11.7 stream, this has become more and more evident where different levels of encryption are being enabled inside the core language as well as the database, not to mention the introduction of the OpenEdge Authentication Gateway. How about PAS or the Authentication Gateway both hooking into, say, Spring Security? So now we're going further with regards to allowing you to integrate into your enterprise security systems and such. So a good deal of focus has been put into security.
Chris, did you want to address that as well?
I was just going to add that, as you move into later releases of 10 and into 11, the support for TLS or SSL 2.0 is inherent, and that's more and more enterprises are requiring that. So that's becomes critical.
All right, here we go. Chris, where can I find out more about ABL injection?
I'm sorry, ABL?
Injection?
Yeah, that was a term that I brought up. ABL injection can be considered on the web. One of the typical attack vectors that somebody will attempt is taking an input field, say Ticketmaster. You're ordering some tickets, and when you put in your first name, last name, if you enter certain text into that text box instead of your first name or last name, you would actually perform a select statement against the database that bypasses the query that was meant to be fired when you submit that page. Think of that same style of attack from a web speed point of view. If your web page doesn't advertise that it's web speed or an ABL site, but somehow somebody figures that out, what if they went into an open text field and tried to perform a SQL injection type attack, but used a for each statement instead of select statement? Where can you find more information on that? There have been some comments, I believe, on the communities.progress.com website. If there aren't, I'm sure there's plenty of people on there who can afford examples on there.
Chad, can our code be signed? What stops an R code file from being substituted by a malicious one?
Yeah, our code can be signed, and the typical way that the base application does do R code signing is by generating an MD5 of the compiled code. At compile time, you would generate an MD5 hash of that R code. And what you would need to do is somehow in your runtime environment, you would produce your R code, you would keep your MD5 runtime hash, and at the actual execution time, you would attempt to say, okay, here's the R code I'm about to execute. Let's make sure that the MD5 of this R code matches what I'm expecting. Now, that would most likely incur quite a bit of overhead because that would be redesigning your application. You would have to do it at a higher level inside your application. I think probably what would be a more recommendable action would be to make sure that R code cannot be substituted. I would lock down the application platform itself, where I would make sure that my ProPath doesn't point to any globally writable folders. I would make sure my ProPath is as short and succinct as possible, and those folders that are part of my ProPath are indeed locked down to the deployment user who owns the R code.
We're getting quite a bit of questions on pricing, and so I wanted to address a couple of things about pricing, but I also wanted to encourage you again to speak directly to your Progress account manager because a lot of it really depends on your particular environment and situation. So the first question is about TDE and what kind of license is required, and similar to that, someone asked about OpenEdge management. So TDE and OpenEdge management are database add-ons, and they can be sold separately, but also part of the Advanced Enterprise Edition with enterprise licenses. Again, if you're interested in either one of those products, both of those products, if you're interested in both, actually AEE is a really great recommendation for you. But if you're only interested in one, you should speak to your account manager and or a services consultant who can do a better assessment of your environment. Again, Authentication Gateway is free with an upgrade to 11.7, but it also is dependent on Progress Application Server. So again, you should speak to your account manager to make sure that you have the right pricing situation for you. As of right now, those are all the questions that I have. If you have additional questions, we'll give it a second if you want to go in and enter them into the questions panel. Otherwise, we might have to end our webinar unless Chad or Chris have anything that they want to add. Nothing specifically? All right, great. So I want to thank everyone for joining us today. I hope that you found this to be extremely valuable and helpful. And again, this is just the first. It's the primer. It's an introduction. What's happening in the market? What things do you need to be concerned about? What are some OpenEdge technologies that can help you? The next one will focus more specifically on the OE products and implementation recommendations. And if you have any questions, again, reach out to your Progress account manager. Reach out to Progress Services, and we will do everything we can to help you. And we appreciate you joining today. Thank you.